I'm presenting the paper titled What Factors Should Paper Reviewer Assignments Rely On? Community Perspectives on Issues and Ideals in Conference Peer Review, authored by myself, Terne Jakobsen, and Anna Rogers. So paper review assignments are matches between submissions to conferences or journals and their available pool of reviewers, taking into account any conflicts of interest and reviewer assignment quotas. So this is an example of how paper reviewer assignments might look like from the area chairs and editors' perspective. So area chairs and editors can edit these assignments manually, guided by their own personal knowledge of the reviewers, or what they can gather from looking through some reviewers' publication histories. In some cases, reviewers have the possibility of bidding on papers, and in other cases, editors are given these affinity scores, which reflect the similarity between the embedding of a submitted paper's abstract and the abstracts of a given reviewer's past publications. Peer review for NLP is increasingly coming under criticism for its arbitrariness, and yet so far studies on paper reviewer assignment systems mostly make their own assumptions about what defines a good match, and then design a system around that. So in this study, we take a step back and ask, what defines a good paper reviewer match, and herein what criteria should be taken into account given the diversity of perspectives in an interdisciplinary field and in a process involving stakeholders with very different goals. And what are the most common issues stakeholders experience in peer review that would influence their perspectives on what would be more ideal and that we might focus on changing. To answer these questions, the most logical first step is to simply ask the people who are involved in this process. So therefore, we designed 3 surveys for the main groups of stakeholders in the peer review process: AC Action Editors, reviewers, and authors. And I will refer to both Action Editors and ACs as editors for the rest of this presentation. All 3 surveys follow the same basic structure, with many of the same questions reformulated to match the different perspectives of the roles. And we validate the quality of the responses by including some questions where respondents might contradict themselves, if not being attentive enough, and by checking coherency in open-ended responses. So anonymous surveys are a great way of learning about people's opinions on sensitive matters, but we do recognize that it has, like any method, some important limitations. So since participation is voluntary, it is reasonable to assume that people who have had issues with the peer review systems are more incentivized to respond. So for our current study, this is not a big problem because we are interested in getting perspectives from those who have had issues and do wish for better peer review. And we recognize that we cannot make any conclusions about the extent to which the issues occur in NLP peer review in general. Other problems can occur from having too broad questions and not considering the limitations of memory. We therefore formulated most questions to be about the respondents' most recent experience with peer review rather than about their overall experience, but we let them reflect on overall experiences in some cases and mostly in open-ended responses. So this figure shows the amount of respondents in the different roles and the overlap of the roles for their last experience at NLP venues. After removing 28 responses that were either incomplete or failed the validation step, we ended up with a total of 180 responses. And that means that it is a fairly modest study, but the amount of responses is comparable to the volume of feedback collected before implementing the ACL rolling review, which was 199 responses. So we asked the respondents for their career status and their experience receiving peer review. We received most responses from academic researchers, PhD students, and postdocs, and overall fewer industry than academic researchers responded to the survey. Responses on experience with receiving reviews are in line with the expected pattern, mainly that it is the more senior researchers who have had their work reviewed more than 10 times, but we also see 65% of the PhD student who had served as reviewers went through peer review more than 5 times, as opposed to 24% of PhD students in the author role. We asked the respondents what types of research papers they had authored, and here they had the possibility to choose multiple types. We see that most respondents have experience with NLP engineering experiments and resource papers. We did not ask how many papers or how much experience they have with a paper type, so therefore this graph does not reflect the volume of papers. It only indicates whether the respondents have or have not authored these types of papers. As one could expect, respondents in the editor role reported experience with more paper types than respondents who were in the reviewer and author role. We asked the respondents about the issues they experienced with the peer review process at their most recent NLP venue and in general at prior venues, and we asked them in both a closed-ended and open-ended question form. But I will just mention the topmost responses here. So editors' most experienced issue is that they do not have enough information about the reviewer. And in open-ended responses, editors especially report interface and workload issues and bad reviewers. Most reviewers report issues with matches that were actually fine in terms of the area of research, but where they did not find the paper interesting. And in open-ended comments, they report issues with choices being forced by editors, for example, by getting papers assigned without being asked and having requests of reassignments denied. And they also report preference for bidding and issues with being assigned papers based on their past area of expertise that are no longer interesting to them. And authors especially report issues with too broad criticism. And in open-ended responses, they describe issues with reviewers expecting certain kinds of research, which is aligned with many authors also reporting experience with bias against certain types of research in the closed-ended responses. And they further indicate inattentive reviews, short reviews, and a mismatch between the score and the text of the review. Currently, there are 4 main ways of processing paper review assignments for NLP venues: manually, and through bidding, and through automated similarity-based methods, and randomly. And then there are mixes of those. We described these options to the respondents and asked them what they knew or believed to be the method used for their last venue. Reviewers and authors were further asked whether they knew or maybe knew or had to make a guess. And we see on the left plot that a large part of reviewers and authors were uncertain or unaware of how paper review assignments were made, which to us suggests a lack of transparency in the process. We then asked respondents what paper assignment process they would prefer. And we see a clear difference between what respondents believe to be the process and what they believe is the more ideal process. Most editors and authors opted for the automated plus manual process, but for the reviewers, this is the second preferred process, with instead larger support for bidding plus manual checks. There is also fairly large support for pure bidding from respondents in all roles. And while pure automated assignments are both known and believed to be, by our respondents, one of the most used methods, it has very little support as an ideal assignment method. In open-ended comments, we received several suggestions for a better process, and some suggested the use of keywords or more fine-grained areas and tracks, potentially as alternative to affinity scores for filtering down the list of papers to bid on. And one respondent stressed that the keywords should be provided by the authors to match what they perceive to be salient aspects of the paper. We saw earlier that one of the most common problems for the editors is that they were not provided with enough information to facilitate the paper review matching. So the follow-up question is what information they are provided with and how useful they find it. So the types of information with the highest utility are links to reviewer profiles, bidding information, and affinity scores. But affinity scores are also the most controversial, since it is also the type of information that the most editors find not very useful and not useful at all. Overall, we see that editors are presented with little structured information about reviewers and have to identify the information they need from a glance at the reviewer's publication record. Which is probably why links to profiles are valued as very useful. Seniority, expertise, and reviewer history notes from other editors are all reported to be useful, but they were never provided directly to many editors. We then asked the respondents which factors they believe are most important for peer reviewer assignments. And the respondents expressed that it is most important that the reviewer has experience with the same tasks as the submitted paper, and the reviewer has shown interest in the paper through bidding if possible. Least important is that the automated affinity score is high. The results also shows variation in importance rankings between and within groups, which has implications for the evaluation of systems where editors' assignments are used as ground truths, because here they could end up modeling the annotator instead of the task. And furthermore, our results shows some first indications that the probability of finding certain factors important may also depend on the type of papers that you publish. So to conclude, we found that the lack of reviewer interest is an important problem for all stakeholders, and that reviewers' interest may not be interpreted directly from their publication histories. To facilitate good reviews, we need to take reviewer interest into account, but also not let bidding entirely control the matching, because that may penalize non-mainstream research. So we further find a lack of transparency in the matching and lack of relevant information given to editors, which leads us to formulate the task of interpretable paper reviewer matching as one where the goal should be to help identify information that the stakeholders themselves wish the decisions to be based on, and to provide that information as justification for the decisions, rather than faithfully interpreting systems that may or may not rely or have access to such information. On a positive note, providing editors with better information is immediately actionable, and based on our survey results, we can recommend providing more of such structured information and to take reviewer interest into account, but include some randomness within tracks to introduce the usage of keywords, to further explore whether some tracks may need specific approaches, and lastly, we recommend to continuously monitor stakeholder issues and wishes. So, thank you for listening, and please check out our surveys and responses on our GitHub repository.